Right now, as you watch this video, some of the world's smartest philosophers are having really heated debates about whether you actually exist. They're questioning whether the chair you're sitting on is real, or whether you might be more like a four-dimensional worm slithering through space-time. And yes, that's a real theory that we're going to talk about today. This is ontology, the branch of philosophy that asks the seemingly simple question, what does it mean for something to actually exist? The answers philosophers have developed are absolutely wild, especially in this century. So today, we're exploring the most mind-bending ontological viewpoints ever conceived. By the end of this video, you might not be entirely sure what real even means. So let's start with a thought experiment that has puzzled philosophers for a very long time. The ship of Theseus. A ship has all its planks gradually replaced over time. Once every original plank is gone, is it still the same ship? Well, traditional thinking creates a kind of puzzle. How much can something change and still be considered the same object? Well, philosopher David Lewis has a radical solution, and it's called purduantism. Instead of thinking of you as one continuous thing from birth to death, purduantists argue that you're more like a four-dimensional object, and you're stretched across space-time. Imagine a literal worm lying on a table with different spatial parts, the head, middle, and your tail. Now imagine your life as a worm, extending through time. Your birth is one end, and your death is the other. And every moment of your life is a different slice or temporal part of the same being. According to purduantism, 5-year-old you, 15-year-old you, and current you are not the same person persisting through time. They're different temporal parts of the same four-dimensional you worm. Now, this sounds really crazy until you realize that it does solve serious philosophical puzzles. The ship of Theseus problem essentially disappears. Different temporal parts of the shipworm have different properties, but it doesn't make the ship a different being. Early parts have original planks, and later parts now have new planks. No contradiction. Think about the statement, I was shorter when I was 10. The normal interpretation says that the same person had different heights at different times, but purduantists' interpretation says that one temporal part of your space-time worm has the property short, while another has the property tall. The implications are kind of strange. Are you responsible for crimes committed by past temporal parts of your worm? Well, they're technically different parts of the same object. And do you really die? Or does your space-time worm simply end? Nothing really changes because different temporal parts just have different properties. Now, this kind of feels wrong to our everyday experience because we feel wholly present right now, not just experiencing one slice of a four-dimensional worm. But purduantists argue that this is an illusion of consciousness. Interestingly, this actually aligns with Einstein's theories of relativity, where space and time are unified into space-time. If time is just another dimension like space, maybe objects really do extend through it the same way they extend through space. Now, endurantists like Peter von Inwagen completely reject this view. They argue that you are wholly present at every moment, that 100% of you exists right now, not just a piece of you. You are the same complete entity moving through time, gaining and losing properties, but remaining fundamentally you. Now, this does create the problem of temporary intrinsics. If you're wholly present at every moment, how can you have contradictory properties, like being both tall now and short at age 5? Enduratists solve this through temporal relativization. You're not simply tall, but tall at this time, and short at that time. Enduratism feels intuitively correct because it matches our lived experience. You feel completely present right now. You have memories of being the same person in the past, and you make plans as the same continuing self for your future. When you say, I did something yesterday, it feels like the same I performed the action. The debate reveals deep questions about identity, change, and the nature of time and space itself. Now, switching gears, let's move on to Graham Harman's object-oriented ontology. Now, this theory makes an even more radical claim that demolishes everything we think about reality's structure. Essentially, your coffee mug, the McDonald's Corporation, Hamlet, a rock, your thoughts, and you yourself all exist on exactly the same ontological plane. None is more real or fundamental than any other. This represents a massive departure from traditional thinking. Plato distinguished between perfect eternal forms and imperfect material copies. Medieval philosophers put God above angels and above matter. And modern science treats fundamental particles as more real than composite objects. Now, Harman throws all of these hierarchies out the window. For Harman, literally anything that can be distinguished as a unit counts as an object. Physical things like rocks, abstract entities like numbers, fictional characters like Sherlock Holmes, institutions like government, and even events like hurricanes are all considered the same thing on an ontological plane. Consider McDonald's Corporation. Now, most people would say it's just a legal fiction, less real than the buildings, employees, and the burgers. But Harman asks why. The corporation itself makes decisions, influences global culture, shapes landscapes, outlives individual employees, and interacts with other entities in ways that have real consequences. In what sense is it less real than you? Both are complex entities that persist over time, have properties, and casually interact with their environment. The most philosophically sophisticated aspect is Harman's theory of withdrawal. No object can ever be completely known or fully accessed by any other object, including humans. There's always something withdrawn, a mysterious and hidden from any attempt to fully grasp it. This operates at every level. You can never fully know another person, no matter how intimate your relationship is. A scientist can never completely exhaust everything about an electron, and even inanimate objects cannot fully access each other. For example, when fire burns cotton, the fire encounters certain cotton properties, but never the cotton as such in its full being. Harman distinguishes between real objects, which withdraw and can never be fully accessed, and sensual objects, the ways real objects appear to other objects. When you look at a tree, you're not seeing the real tree, but the sensual tree. an object appearing to you through your particular sensory apparatus. A bird encounters a completely different sensual tree object. The real tree withdraws behind all of these appearances, though. Now, this explains how the same real object appears completely different to different beings. A hammer might appear one way to a carpenter, like a tool, but another way to a physicist, as molecules, and perhaps a completely different way to an animal. Now, none captures the full hammer reality because they don't necessarily contradict or support each other. And Timothy Morton extends this with hyperobjects, entities that are so massively distributed in time and space that they resist traditional comparison. Climate change, for example. We can measure temperature changes, observe melting glaciers, and track carbon dioxide. But we can never directly encounter climate change. It's too big, too temporarily extended, and too complex for any single perspective. Yet, it's undeniably real and causally effective. We're increasing living in an age of hyperobjects. Global warming, nuclear materials, mass extinction, the internet, that fundamentally exceed human understanding while simultaneously shaping reality in profound ways. Now, critics argue that this ontological view ignores crucial questions about power, history, and social relations by flattening everything into generic objects. Others worry that it makes important distinctions impossible. Harman responds that they're not saying all objects are practically equivalent, but they're making the ontological claim that all objects exist on the same fundamental plane of being. Now, it addresses genuine problems in contemporary thought. At a time when AI, global corporations, climate change, and complex technological systems are increasingly shaping human life, maybe we do need better ways of thinking about non-human agency and reality. Next, some of you may have heard of, but an ancient Indian philosopher, Shankara, made perhaps the most audacious ontological claim in history, that everything you think you know about reality is essentially an illusion. According to Advaita Vedanta, the only one thing that truly exists is Brahman, an infinite, undifferentiated consciousness that is the ground of all being. Picture reality like a movie theater where you are completely absorbed in the film. You cry at the sad parts, laugh at the funny ones, and you might get angry at others. But then the lights come on, and you suddenly remember it was just images projected on a screen. The drama, characters, and the entire story, none of it was real in a way that you experienced it. For Shankara, that is exactly our situation. The entire phenomenal world, like you, me, trees, stars, thoughts, and emotions, all of it is Maya, a cosmic illusion projected by Brahman. The ultimate reality is pure, undifferentiated consciousness, and everything else is like a dream within that consciousness. The twist that makes this truly mind-bending is that you are not necessarily separate from Brahman. Your individual self is actually identical to the universe self, which is identical to Brahman, meaning you are literally the ultimate reality. But you've forgotten this truth because you are caught up in the illusion of separateness. Andrew Demonsky's research shows fascinating parallels between this view and ancient Greek ontological monism, particularly in the argument that true being must be one, unchanging, and eternal. Now, of course, critics raise obvious questions. If everything is an illusion, why does the illusion persist? How can an illusion be so systematically convincing? Well, Shankar's response involved complex theories about different levels of reality and the nature of ignorance. But critics argue that these explanations at some point become circular. Still, there is something profound here. Modern physics tells us that solid matter is mostly empty space, that particles are probability waves, and that observation actually affects reality. So maybe Shankar was onto something about the illusionary nature of our everyday experience. And the implications are pretty staggering. If this view is correct, then the entire project of Western philosophy, meaning distinguishing mind from matter, subject from object, and self from world, is based on a fundamental category mistake. There are no separate entities to distinguish because there is only one reality appearing as many. Now, George Berkeley, an 18th century Irish philosopher, made an equally bold claim that challenges these same basic assumptions. His claim is that material objects just don't exist. According to his immaterialism, only minds and ideas exist. When you look around right now, you're not seeing material objects. You're experiencing ideas or perceptions in your mind. Berkeley's famous motto, Este est percepi, to be is to be perceived, captures this radical view. For something to exist, it must either be a mind that perceives or an idea that is perceived. There is no third category of material substance existing independently of perception. Now, he didn't arrive at this conclusion arbitrarily. He actually followed careful logical arguments, starting with premises that most people accept. Everything we know about the external world comes through our senses: colors, sounds, textures, tastes, and smells. We can all agree that we see these things differently. These are all experiences in consciousness. The crucial step is that he asks what these sensory experiences are made of. When you see red, what exactly is red? Is redness a property existing in the object itself, independently of any perceiver? Well, he makes the case that this doesn't make sense. Colors, tastes, sounds, smells, and tactile sensations are inherently experimental, meaning they cannot exist without a mind to experience them. A world without conscious beings would be a world without colors, without sounds, or any sensory qualities whatsoever. Now, this leads to a devastating question. If you strip away all sensory qualities of an object, what's left? Well, philosophers before Berkeley typically answered that some kind of material substance remains, a mysterious something that supports or bears all sensory qualities. But Berkeley points out that we never actually experience this supposed material substance. We only ever encounter these sensory qualities themselves. Now, Berkeley's attack on material substance is philosophically sophisticated. Material substance is supposed to exist independently of perception and support sensory qualities, but it cannot itself have any detectable properties. So, material substance would be a completely unknowable, imperceivable, and propertyless something that somehow gives rise to all sensory properties that we experience. Now, Berkeley asks why we should believe in such a mysterious entity when we have no evidence for it and can't even form a coherent concept of it. Much simpler to say the sensory qualities themselves are all there is. The redness, roundness, and sweetness of an apple doesn't need support by invisible material substance. They can exist as ideas in a perceiving mind. Now, the obvious objection is that if material objects are just in minds, what happens when nobody's looking? Does your house just disappear when you leave for work? Well, Berkeley's elegant solution involves God. God is continuously perceiving everything in the universe. The consistency and regularity of the natural world isn't maintained by martial laws operating on material substances, but by God's constant, universal perception. When you do leave your house, it continues to exist because God continues to perceive it. When you return and you find everything the way it was when you left it, then this reflects the perfect consistency of divine perception. Now, this theological solution serves multiple purposes. It explains apparent objectivity and regularity of the physical world while maintaining idealist metaphysics. And, conveniently, it also provides proof of God's existence. The very fact that we experience a coherent, law-governed world proves that there must be a supreme mind maintaining these experiences in perfect order. Now, Samuel Johnson famously refuted Berkeley's by kicking a stone, saying, "I refute it thus." But this kind of completely misses Berkeley's point. Berkeley never denied that you experience kicking something hard, just that this experience doesn't require material substance. Now, Berkeley would say Johnson experienced exactly what the theory predicts: complex, tactical, visual, and auditory sensations occurring in regular patterns because they're ideas in God's mind. Berkeley's immaterialism remains a standing challenge to common sense materialism. You can't simply point to material objects as evidence against Berkeley, because he would argue that you're really pointing to sensory experiences. And you can't appeal to scientific evidence because Berkeley would say that science studies regular patterns in our perceptions, which his theory explains just as well as materialism. Now, mereological nihilism makes perhaps the most counterintuitive claim imaginable, that composite objects, or things made up of parts, don't actually exist. Everything from your car to your body is pure fiction. According to philosophers like Peter von Inwagen and Trenton Merricks, only the most fundamental building blocks of reality actually exist. The term mereological comes from mereology, or the study of parts and wholes. Nihilists argue that while parts exist, wholes composed of those parts don't. The argument starts with the question about composition. Consider a table made of wood. At what precise point do atoms arranged in a certain pattern become a table over and above those atoms? Is there some magical moment when enough atoms get together in the right configuration and suddenly a new entity pops into existence? Von Inwagen argues that this moment never exists. It never comes. What we call a table is really just atoms arranged table-wise. The atoms exist, and their spatial relationships exist, but there's no additional entity, no table substance over and above the atoms themselves. We use words like table because it's practically useful to talk about certain arrangements of atoms. But this doesn't mean that tables actually exist as entities in their own right. Consider the parallel with flock of birds. When you see a flock, you're really seeing individual birds flying in coordinated patterns. The flock is a useful concept for describing birds' behavior, but most people wouldn't say the flock exists as an entity separate from individual birds. Mereological nihilists extend this reasoning to all composite objects, including what we normally think are very real, like tables, cars, and even human bodies. Interestingly, von Inwagen makes an exception for living beings. Organisms might genuinely exist as unified wholes because they have spatial organization through life processes. Cells in your body aren't just arranged in patterns. They're engaged in ongoing processes of maintaining life that does create genuine entity. Now, when an organism dies, composition ceases, and you're left with atoms arranged corpse-wise, not an actual corpse. But even this exception is controversial among mereological nihilists. Some extend nihilism to cover all composite objects, including living ones, and others question what makes life processes so special that they can create genuine composition when purely physical processes cannot. The biggest challenge for mereological nihilism is explaining meaningful talk about non-existent objects. If tables don't exist, what makes "there's a table in the kitchen" true or false? Mereological nihilists respond with paraphrasing strategies. Instead of "there's a table in the kitchen," say "there are atoms arranged table-wise in the kitchen." Now, every statement about composite objects can allegedly be paraphrased into statements about fundamental parts and their arrangements. This allows nihilists to preserve practical usefulness of ordinary language and maintain that composite objects don't actually exist. We can continue talking about tables and cars for convenience, but we should understand that we're really talking about particular arrangements of fundamental particles. Now, interestingly, mereological nihilism gains plausibility from modern physics. Quantum mechanics suggests that what we think of as solid objects are mostly empty space with probability clouds of particles. If atoms are mostly empty space, with electrons as probability distributions, and even nuclei are quarks held together by quantum fields, then in what sense does a solid table exist? Some interpretations suggest even particles are just excitations in underlying quantum fields. If reality is fundamentally made of fields and mathematical relationships rather than discrete objects, then perhaps our everyday composite objects are useful fictions that we impose on more fundamental reality. So, from four-dimensional worms to conscious mountains and fictional characters as real as your neighbors, we have explored some of the most creative, challenging, and downright weird ways that humans have thought about existence. Now, these ontologies reveal just how much of our common sense about reality is actually a choice. Everything that we perceive as reality, some might perceive differently, and that's okay. The entire idea of an ontological viewpoint is to help you understand reality as a whole, not just individual parts playing the same game. So, with that said, if you guys have any other ontological theories or ideas that you would like to discuss, be sure to leave them in the comments. And as always, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see y'all next time.